Good. My name is Sacha Faust. I have a pretty long title, but I'll say pretty quick. Principal Technical Lead for Microsoft Cloud and Enterprise. So what that means is my playground is not just Azure, but services that runs under Azure as well, including Identity Stack, CRM, a bunch of stuff. So it's pretty big. So obviously one of the challenge there is how do you do impact and how do you actually move the needle a little bit. So this is my experience. It's not necessarily a representation of where Microsoft is now. It's more about where Microsoft was a few years ago. So we got the green light to start being able to talk a little bit more about the strategy. The overall view of the presentation is my personal experience and how I try to solve the problem. I think I made some dent in moving the needle, and there's still obviously a lot more work to do. So from a red team perspective, sort of what I'll go through is how did we start crawling, walking, running, adapting, and where are we at now in terms of what I consider adapting plus. So this is a longer presentation. I'll try to condense it as much as possible, where from a crawl perspective, I hear a lot of companies reaching out to me and asking, you know, we want to build a red team. We're not quite sure what that means, and why don't you come over and help us do, you know, find more cross-site scripting. And the reality is that's not really what red teaming is. It's not necessarily an application kind of a component level review. So from a crawl perspective, the phase where early on that we start thinking about is really internalize what assume breach is from a red team perspective. This is where my brain was. Assume breach is not only protecting, but assuming the fact that a fault will happen in the system, and would you know about it, and can you recover from that? I think a lot of people in the industry are really kind of having blinders on let's throw a lot of money and resource towards protection. I think you should continue doing that, but maybe kind of spreading it out a little bit further and start looking at detection and response. So from a crawl perspective, really focus on internalizing what assume breach was, and a lot of focus also on breach narrative, like spending a lot of time documenting how we actually are breaching, not just from an hypothetical perspective, but really like here's the truth. Moving away from the concept of threat model with hypothetical threats and just pointing the facts that, okay, here's our observations in the process, and here's some recommendations. And they were mostly kind of tactical recommendation, I would say. So consider the crawl phase is very, very tactical, very early on in ingesting what assume breach was. Now, from a walking perspective, it was interesting is when it started, the walking process is more around start thinking about identity. What is us as a red team initially within Azure, and now we upgraded, I guess, to CNE. But what did that really mean? And what that meant was, like, let's define measurement of success here. Like, what is measurement of success? And success is not bugs, right? So you file a bunch of bugs, fine, okay, I can spit out 1,000 bugs, and that's used to be a measurement of success, but we never really looked at what really happened beyond that. So for us, measurement of success is really an increase in mean time to compromise and mean time to objective. So there's a big difference between compromise and objective. Compromise is, okay, you spearfish someone, you get your foothold inside the infrastructure, and mean time to objective, you actually got, you got your target, so you got your flag. So an objective could be, I want a key inside the HSM. That would be an objective. There's a significant amount of difference between when we actually got inside the infrastructure and our way to actually objective. Define clear rule of engagement. You may want to go contact your legal department and ask them to sign off on that. So we actually got our rules of engagement defined and signed off by both our legal department and at the time our VP, Sacha, who is now our CEO. So we know up to CEO, it's very, very clear what we can do and so on. We're very focused on P0 scenarios, break glass scenarios, sort of we're completely screwed here. We focus heavily on that. Impact to target, collateral damage is okay. It is a transient risk. The dependencies are transient risk. You can move from one step to the other. So we're looking at it purely from a blinder perspective and looking, okay, I'm just going to look at identity stack and try to find a holes there without looking at the dependencies of them. And dependencies, don't think just DLL, dependencies is other teams as well. So we're really, we're okay with collateral damage. That just amplifies the message. Scale, it's a big infrastructure. If you just think about Azure, it's really big. So for us, it was really a scale problem. Now, from a culture perspective, we define it as let's just keep making it harder. Again, increase mean time to compromise the objective, decrease of detection and recovery. So we have a mindset within this red team that let's just make it harder, 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 harder. Very engineer focused. Microsoft at the core is an engineering company. Our biggest problem is scale. We have other problems as well, but scale is really one of the big ones. We stopped basically swinging the stick and started becoming much more diplomatic. We are not the enforcer. We are not telling you what to do. We are suggesting. Now, you go ahead and do it. That's really up to you. But we do expect ETAs at some point, right? So we do drive towards having ETAs on service team. And the enforcement on those ETAs is really based on our engineering expectations in terms of recovery time objective and mitigation timeline as well. And we think and try to operate as next-gen APT, which I'll give you a little bit of an overview there. So we're not looking necessarily at what's currently existing now. We're looking, okay, based on technologies and based on where the company is going, what are some of the tactics that will be used against us in technologies as well? So machine learning, AI, and so on and so forth are definitely part of our day-to-day kind of thinking. Now, moving towards more the run, I saw it earlier in, I think it's ACoD presentation about the OODA loop, Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act, or also known as the Boyd loop. I started looking around and says, okay, we have a scale problem. We sort of have an identity. We have good breach narrative. We have good like rules of engagement and so on. Now it's time to start thinking, really focusing on kind of automation and speeding things up. So part of that is automating our decision loop. And I looked around the industry and I looked also internally, and I felt that from an observation perspective, we have a lot of data. I mean, it is insane the amount of data that's available to me within Microsoft, but the industry also has a lot of data. So I didn't really feel that we could do much of a dent there, or me personally. From an orientation perspective, I felt that was pretty weak. Like we're sort of kind of, we don't have a GPS from an offense perspective. Right, so we have recon, we have like an Nmap tool that gives us port, and then you go in there and then compromise that machine. Then what's next? We couldn't really anticipate and build routes towards specific objective. So I felt that that was an area where basically as a company we can make improvement there. We have enough resource available to us, so let's basically spend a little bit of time on Orient. From a decision perspective, from an attacker, we want to take all routes, so we didn't really invest there. I made a presentation back in 2014, I think, around data-driven offense and infiltrate, where we suggested the use of ML for decide. I won't go too much in detail. That's where we were about 2014. Obviously, we spent a little bit of time there. And from an act perspective, there's tons of tools out there, either community tools or stuff that we can build in-house. I felt we're pretty solid there. Microsoft has made some significant investment from a command and control perspective and internal use. So I personally opted for Orient as a sort of a meaningful impact, and basically started looking a little bit more into that. And what I realized by implementing some of those approaches is that I'm starting to think a lot like a blue teamer, right? I'm starting to think really like from an automation perspective, I start thinking like a blue team. And that's where, from an automation perspective, we have some automation around our decision loop. And then the problem is once you start running or scaling is how do you actually drive mitigation? Because from an exec perspective, they're looking at you as, you used to come with 5 problems, now you're coming with like 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 and more. So like we can't really digest this. We cannot digest the learnings generated by the red team fast enough. And that was causing me some challenges because there were some head bumps here and there. I felt that we didn't really push the bar. Again, our objective is decrease of detection and recovery and increase of compromise and objective. So I had to switch my mindset a little bit, and that's where my brain switched a little bit more to the blue side. And in 2014, 2015, after a lot of time spent on that, I made a statement that says basically red team in enterprise is actually purple, right? So no matter what you say, no matter what you do, at the end of the day, in the enterprise, you're gonna have to help the blue teamer at some point. Else your measurement of success, if it's the same as ours, will not be accomplished. You're not gonna meet them. You're gonna come up with a ton of bugs, but nothing is gonna move. There's a great person that we have at the office called John Lambert, who's the GM for Threat Intel. He's basically said how I felt since the beginning. I started my career around 98 professionally, and unprofessionally maybe before. And I've always thought in graph in my head. I always visualize in graph. So he made a statement that says, basically attackers are thinking in graph and defenders are thinking in list. And I think that's true. I've spent a significant amount of time with defenders. I've been at Microsoft since 2007 with different roles. And I definitely saw that as a bunch of lists and not much kind of visualization or correlation of items. So that's really the difference is defenders are really thinking about listing. And from an attacker perspective, I came in with that mindset where this is a representation of a forest where you have forests and domains and computers and AD objects, AD users and so on. So that was my mindset. And I started thinking a little bit more about that and said, okay, how can we sort of formalize this? So I'm using, I know I'm going pretty fast, but we don't have that much time. I'm using a very common attack that I hope all of you kind of understand. And if you don't, let me kind of give you a quick overview. So pass the hash is an inherent problem within Windows. Trust me, I've headbutt with some of those developers as well and try to mitigate. I think we've came up with some decent things with credential guards and so on. At the end of the day, assume breach, right? Assume these things will fail. So from a pass the hash perspective and a graph mindset is the implicit relationship that you can have is an AD user is a member of a local administrator group, and that group is part of a computer, right? That's very basic. So from an explicit relationship, you can say, okay, this AD user is actually managing or has the right to manage this asset. That doesn't mean he's the owner of it, but he can manage it. The real problem comes in is when somebody else logs into that asset, right? So another user is logging into that particular computer, leaving either his clear text credential or his hash on that particular computer, and therefore you can say this AD user pose a risk of pass the hash pivoting towards the other user. And the C-level suite, you like KPIs? Well, just measure that. And then you have your KPI. And it's not just between one user to the other one. Again, risk is you can actually transit from one stage to the other and so on. So you have this concept of depth. You can actually generate a route from compromised asset towards the objective. So you can have nested route either through pass the hash or other things as well. You can start blending them together. So all this looks nice and everything, but when you go back to the quote-unquote, what I call the one graph, is you have your AD infrastructure or forest infrastructure, and now the red team can add a node in there. It says, there's now a red line on an AD user, and the red team says, well, this AD user is a risk of another one, right? So kind of thinking the red team mindset and kind of just adding our nodes, and also democratizing the red team as well. So red team should not be working in isolation, as far as I'm concerned. Should be able to document and add their own notes and then let everybody else seize it, right, to some extent. Obviously, if we're giving all the recipes to nail us to everyone, we would have problems. But I think really thinking about democratizing your red team and red team mindset and red team data as well, you'll start getting some interesting results. Things like self-serve reporting and so on becomes available. I'll skip those. So if you want to model spear phishing, for example, right? So all you have to do is any AD user that has an email is open to spear phishing. That's basically it, regardless of defense mechanism, right? So the fact is, okay, that AD user has an external entry, and then that's how you would model a spear phishing. And then you can count these things, you can visualize them, You can use a reporting structure, which we do have to do org chain and so on and so forth. So all these things become fairly easy to model. And now you can model between those two relationships. You can say how many users are actually open to spear phishing, and is any of the spear phishing users through pass the hash, is there a route to high value targets, for example? So that's how I personally think about it, and that's how I'm representing it as well. So obviously the spear phishing is there. Now let's go back to the sort of blue mindset, or the reality that, you know, whoever is paying my paycheck needs some output. It's good to break stuff. It's good to walk away from it. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes it's a lot more painful to actually drive progress. So from an exec perspective, what is really the risk that they're accepting? So at the end of the day, if you're looking at pass the hash, right? So you have the red teamer and you have the blue teamer. They're both asking the same question, right? Can it lead to domain compromise? That's one question that you could ask, or you could ask, like, does it lead to high value asset and so on? Let's just keep it simple. Is there a route from compromised asset through this particular vector towards the domain admin? And the relationship can be defined in a somewhat formal definition in this fashion: is if you have an AD user and then you have a nested risk of pass the hash, and hopefully, do I know how to use this? There you go. So the little asterisk here means it's a transitive risk. It's not one user to the other, is you can follow the chain through it. And that user is part of a local administrator, a domain administrator group of the given domain. So from there, you can formulate the question. It's the same question for both blue and red, right? And the implementation is the same as well. And so that's from a graph perspective, and then you start looking at the code. I'm not advocating Neo4j. I think it's a great GraphDB, but the language makes it very easy to understand, because then you can actually do a graph view, and then you can fairly easily translate that. But the question is actually implemented exactly in this code here, where out of this, you can find all the paths through pass the hash towards a given target. So a great example, and I'll raise my hat for them because it actually allowed me to start taking stuff out the bunker and start talking to it publicly, is the Bloodhound tooling is leveraging this tactic. I think they released it, I believe, late last year. So you have somewhat of an implementation out there for adversary, for defenders, and red teamers as well. At least something that you can say, no, Sacha is not talking like crazy, that somebody actually may have been influenced and released it, right? So from that perspective, you take the answer out of this query, and then you feed both ends. Again, the action is very contextual, but the question is the same, right? So another way as well is, let's say a lot of people are moving to the cloud. So if you take an AD, a forest infrastructure, and you're moving to the cloud, you can add a new graph there. You can join those graphs. So the bottom end is a subscription. I'm not sure if it's super clear, but let's see here. So you have a subscription here, which is basically Azure concept of, let's say, quote unquote, a domain in the cloud. So you have a subscription, and you have resource of a cloud service. And a subscription can have virtual machines, and the cloud service is exposing that virtual machine, right? So very, very simple graph. I would say the reality of our Azure graph is a lot bigger, but I kept it fairly simple. So when you start assigning managers of subscription, it's based off AD user through federation, or you can actually use Azure Active Directory as well. So now the red team can come in and augment this graph and just simply point out that there's a risk of cloud pivoting here. There's a risk of on-premise to cloud pivoting. So even before we have like the tooling to teach them and so on, we've already defined a language for both parties to talk. And then the red team says, by the way, like this exists, even before we take advantage of it, right? So that's your knowledge transfer plus, is you no longer have to prove these things. Obviously, you have to work on gaining credibility in your data source and so on. But once they trust the data source, you can just point out, like, hey, this is a problem here. And then red team can go on and figure out how to leverage this towards objective and so on. But at least the blue team already has this knowledge and can do something about it. And from a C-level suite reporting, you can already measure, you can just count this number of pivoting and start measuring and initiating burn down. So I'll go a little bit quick. We have 5 minutes. I'm actually pretty good on time. So if you think about it, if both parties are sort of looking at the one graph on both sides, the red team is really focused on precision, right? So we want route to target. And the blue team is really kind of a breadth problem, is they want to have measurements in terms of, you know, how many is there, what's the priority level, and so on, so they can drive automation. So red team is really focused on precision and automation as well, consider the sort of red bot. So in my job description, all I say is I teach machine how to do breach operation. That's pretty much all I do amongst operational lead and so on and so forth. But the reality is the precision, the kind of focus on precision is very useful for the blue team as well, and the automation is very useful for blue team. So when I'm talking about attack automation, these are automatic training sets for your machine learning. Those are security synthetics. They can be transferred to security synthetics so that you're no longer looking at a risk at a point in time. Is the red team is now transferring these things to standard engineering practice, which was one of my personal objectives when I joined the team a number of years ago. So from an offense perspective, if you put sort of the purple mindset on it, is everything is transferable. Everything is transferable. Both teams are thinking it the same, it's just the outcome are different. So now you have actually measurement, you can measure the success. And one way of measuring success, for example, is once the blue team has a burn down, you say, hey, we gave it to them, right? Once it burns down, hey, we gave it to them. When it goes back up, again, we gave it to them, right? So it's really about thinking not just red team in isolation and so, oh, we broke everything. It's like try to legitimately do an impact. So I'll go very, very quick on the Adapt Plus, which is what I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, and I think there's more time. I need to think further on that. So one of my personal objectives is beat log replication time. If you operate faster than log replication time, you have a smash and grab operation every time. You will not get caught, right? So assume breach, assume you're going to get caught, right? So run super fast. And again, it's sort of a mouse experiment, but what we've enabled is we gave the mouse a GPS. And now the defenders are like, wow, that was so fast, how did you do that? Now we're putting a lot of pressure on them in a very diplomatic way because we're giving out all the tools. So they're very receptive to that. And then the red team goes back to the core, is thinking in red, thinking very offense, and still thinking about reduction in terms of our measurement of success is compromise up, objective up, detection down, recovery down. So think about, for example, I hear a lot about red team breach and, oh, we broke this and so on. Start thinking about recovery games. Apply gamification approach to the process, right? So if you keep banging on them and you don't provide solutions and you don't measure anything, you're not really making any progress. So my mindset has been for quite some time is yes, we continue to do breach operation because they're a great case study. They're a great opportunity to actually fund research and further advancement from an attack perspective. But I'm really trying to transition this from breach operation to recovery games. At the end of the day, if you assume breach, you gotta have to recover. And if you don't play recovery games, you will not basically, from my experience, is you're not gonna decrease the mean time to detect. There's no incentive for detection to actually work. So even if you have an ISC, even if you have like a signature and so on, have you ever tested that the signal propagation is actually happening? You'll be surprised. At the end of the day, do you also know if the defenders, and by the way, we are all blue team, regardless of which color you think you are. At the end of the day, in an enterprise, you're all blue team, right? So if you're not playing these games and you're not really testing the end-to-end, I'm not sure if we're really making progress. So think from try to mature from breach operation to recovery games and try to measure as much as possible. That being said, my Adapt Plus, what I'm kind of thinking about right now, I'm really thinking offense, which I love going back to that, is red team decision loop, keep automating, We've introduced the use of band arm back in at Infiltrate a couple of years ago. I would say we definitely move forward on that. Internalize indicators of monitoring, detection, eviction, and recovery, which means even though you think a certain breach with your indicators of compromise and so on, from an attacker perspective, they have to look at, or at least from my perspective, what's available in terms of monitoring? How fast can they recover, right? And have they recovered? And then you can measure those routes and actually see, well, wait a minute, they changed their tactics, something is up, because we used to get evicted in 5 hours, now we're getting evicted in 20 minutes, right? So thinking heavily about that. Again, security and synthetic attack verification and so on, something that's reusable. And kill chain, not just offense, not just defense, think both sides. I think I'm out of time. That's it. Questions? Yeah. Sorry, do I have time for questions? Okay, sorry. Go. Sure, go ahead.
This is probably a simple one. So when you're graphing out sort of the path from the user to domain admin or whatever it may be, the common approach is sort of use path to hash to compromise system and then escalate from there and then move further. So when you're mapping sort of all that into Neo4j, is Neo4j doing that overlap? So if you see, one user is going to a system that has shared privileges with a higher level user that can potentially compromise. Are you doing that, or does it not see value in it?
But so let me try to understand the question. Are you asking how do I transition from one user to the other, and if Neo4j offers this capability?
No, I'm saying if a low privilege user shares privilege on some other system with a high privilege.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Do you see that, when you're mapping that out in Neo4j, is that what you're looking for, or do you not see value in it?
So I think the question is around how do I identify high value assets and how do I find the routes to them, or if I can visualize. So it's very contextual. So group membership, for example, you have to kind of understand what that group means. And the members of a given group would be a target, for example. So if you really, the graph I'm showing you now is very, very small. I would say a few years ago we were about 60 million nodes, about 160 million edges. Running on Community Edition, for example, that's where we were pre-funding. We're obviously post-funding at this point. So you have to apply context, obviously, but you have your knowledge base around. So domain administrator is kind of one that everybody understands, but you may actually have other ones as well. So Neo4j cannot do that for you, but Neo4j will give you the route towards the one that you want to get. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. So, for example, what I would do is I manually label high-value assets that I want to go after, and then I just say match P equal whatever, and then it gives me all the routes. And the advantage of that is you don't necessarily try all of them. If people trust your data, then you've saved a whole lot of time, and then they can aggregate this view and see kind of where's the biggest problem. Let's say you may have 1 million routes or 1.5 million routes towards target. By looking at the graph, you can actually identify which machine is causing the biggest problem because that's the most edge, right? So it's sort of a prioritization. It provides you prioritization as well. There's other tricks here and there. I will release blog posts over each of those steps in much more detail, so hopefully you'll get more answer. Yeah. Any more questions? All right, thank you.